40 to 50 minutes here, and I know Laura, wonderful Laura, has some of the Jamie Kennedy coveted French fries. Be sure to grab yourself a cone of those. The bar remains open throughout the evening. I know there are a lot of new faces in the audience tonight. I want to welcome you all very much to this, Chris, our 14th Mass Talk. We have been conducting these for going on 2 years now. Our offices, Mass LDP, are just at the end of this laneway. You'll see the lights lit up. It's a storefront there. Mass is an unusual kind of company. This month we're actually celebrating our 3rd birthday, and we exist to design public engagement strategies on behalf of government, public agencies, and occasionally corporations too. Right now we're working on a citizens reference panel and civic lottery to create a new culture plan for Hamilton. We're working with the YMCA National to develop a new strategy for their federation. We're working with the Montagues and Capulets of the Great Canadian Outdoors. This is the trails movement in Canada. The people who want to hike, the people who want to ATV, the people who want to ski or ride horses on our trails. Our client is the Trans-Canada Trail Foundation, which for the 150th anniversary of Canada wants to complete what will have been a 25-year project to connect this country and connect us to our outdoors by building trails across the nation. We're also working on a municipal strategic plan for a municipality in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. This is something that not so many months ago we published on our wish list. This is a quirky way of doing business development. We talk about the projects we would like to work on. And so among them was to work with the municipality to involve more citizens in the development of a city's strategic plan. We're happy that has come to fruition. One thing that's not listed on that list of 10 projects, however, is to do something around food policy. And in preparation for this evening, and actually for the past couple of months, this is something that Chris Ellis has been nudging us towards. It's an incredibly interesting, dynamic area of public policy right now. All of you are here this evening because you know it, and we're very fortunate to be able to welcome Rod McCrae to tell us a little bit more about the state of play in that field this evening. Before I introduce Rod, I want to thank, of course, the staff here at Jamie Kennedy. All things Jamie Kennedy do so much to exemplify the kind of food culture that I think many of us wish we had more of here in Ontario. Also, part of my briefing notes for this evening included the terrific report, and public policy reports, I probably don't need to tell anyone here, can be a little dry. Scaling Up Urban Agriculture in Toronto is a terrific series of reports published this summer by the McCrae Foundation. You can download it for free. Lots of work that Rod has done is included in all of this. One of the principal's authors. I encourage you to take a look at it. Lastly, by way of announcements and news, I have to point to this panel behind me. We're very excited that in December we're going to be bringing Richard Wilkinson, the famed British social epidemiologist, quoted by Cameron, Brown, Miliband, on the lips of many over in the UK. His book, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone, has made big waves. It will be his first visit to Canada. We're taking him to meet with parliamentarians, half the deputy ministers in Ottawa, all the deputy ministers in Toronto, a 350-person event in Toronto, then we ship him to Calgary and we take him to Vancouver. He doesn't know just how big Canada is. But he will once we're done with them, and I hope that you will consider taking one of the last 30 tickets that are available. I just sold one to this woman with her iPad, 28 available. Her iPad just connected, she bought 2 of them. It'll be at the Betty Oliphant Theatre at the National Ballet School, December the 10th. You can get it online or ask any of my colleagues on the way out. And Jamie, we're really happy that you're here as well this evening. We just finished singing your praises. So with that, let me introduce Rod McCrae, an assistant professor at York University's Faculty of Environmental Studies. He's a food policy analyst who over the course of the past 25 years has worked for governments, businesses, and NGOs on the transition to sustainable and health-promoting food systems. He was also the first coordinator of the Toronto Food Policy Council and holds a doctorate from McGill University, which his daughter has just spent her first month there, I guess, in her BA. So two things I've learned about Rod already. He keeps this academic thing in the family because his father was also an agriculturalist who ran the Nova Scotia Agricultural College. They had some fierce debates, maybe we can get into that later. But I think for lay people and experts alike, when they look at the pace of change over the course of the past 25 years, suddenly we know people like Jamie Kennedy, we know about Alice Waters in the US, we know about Jamie Oliver in the UK, we're reading Michael Pollan. What's changed over the course of the past 25 years that has put food on people's lips?
Well, I think one of the most encouraging signs is we don't have any square tomatoes. Does anybody remember the square tomato from 25, 30 years ago?
No.
Well, the square tomato was this actually, I mean, it was perversely brilliant, really. I mean, it came out of the California tomato industry. They used conventional plant breeding, not genetic engineering, to create this square tomato. So they actually changed a round thing into a square thing. Now the problem was they did it because they said we're losing a lot of money shipping round objects in square boxes. So we're shipping all these tomatoes all over North America, and we're losing money at it. And so rather than change the container, they decided to change the tomato. And so the problem with the square tomato was that it had no flavor. The joke at the time was that there was more flavor in the box it was shipped in than the tomato itself. Now, to its credit, it fit very nicely in your sandwich. You know, you didn't have to worry about, you know, when you get the fresh tomato out of the garden and it doesn't fit in your sandwich and you're sitting there watching television and you take your first bite and the goop slops all over your pants, right? Well, you didn't have that problem with the square tomato because it didn't have any goop. And it also never got red, it was always just green.
Really?
But it failed, of course, because it had no flavor. It failed because, you know, we were moving out of that phase, which I think, again, is one of the big transitions from 25, 30 years ago. We were moving out of that phase of the food industry and being able to homogenize taste, which has been a key sort of driving force to create profitability, was to, you know, get as many people eating the same things and having the stuff stay on the shelf as long as possible, so you could create a sort of an everlasting market for it. We're moving out of that phase, and as you say, we've got, you know, places like this and all kinds of innovative little so-called niches in the system where you can really diversify your taste buds. You can find all kinds of fusion food. Of course, Toronto is this incredibly culturally diverse place, ethnically diverse place with all kinds of different opportunities for eating. So all these things are positive signs. The trick is that it's still actually, in the grand scheme of things, only marginal. The forces that largely created the square tomato, unfortunately, are still the dominant forces in the food system. But equally, all these actors in the food system are vulnerable to the kind of advocacy work probably that many of us in this room are involved in. So even though it looks sort of monolithic at times, it looks like we have these very large corporate actors who control the way the system works, and that's really true. I mean, Canada has the most oligopolized food system in the Western world, so we have the fewest number of strong economic players that rule how the system works. Even though that exists, these major players are incredibly vulnerable to certain kinds of pressures, and a lot of it is because they rely entirely on volume to make money. If they don't have a lot of people buying their stuff, or the retailers don't have a lot of people moving in and out of their shops, they don't do very well because they actually don't make much money on any particular item. So the margins, as the economists say, are all pretty thin. And so it actually doesn't take that many people or that much organization to cause store managers, for example, to start phoning head office in a panic, you know, basically saying the consumers are revolting, what are we going to do? And part of our challenge now is to take advantage of these vulnerabilities so that we can scale up all these good things that are happening, all these sort of beacons of light that represent food system change. We've got to scale them up and out now. That's our main challenge.
Now, in Sandy Houston's introduction to the report, he says that our food system isn't working. But I assume that when you started the Toronto Food Policy Council, however many years ago, 1990, so 20 years ago, the food system wasn't working then either. But tell us more about the sort of changes between Toronto circa 1990 and the genesis of the council and where we find ourselves today.
Well, in 1990, when it was started, there really wasn't a sense of food as a municipal agenda item. So when we got going, the first problem was just to get somebody to, answer the phone call or open the door, because, I'd walk in, I'd say, we want to talk to you about food, and they'd say, why? I mean, we don't do food here. And so that was the first major challenge to overcome in those days. And if it hadn't been for some very key actors in the public health department and some key municipal councillors and their staff, like Jack Layton and Dan Leckie, we wouldn't have been able to move that agenda forward very effectively, because there was just phenomenal resistance. And of course, at that time, there wasn't really a lot of activity to point to. We didn't have a lot of the current organizations so vibrant as they are now. We didn't have the sheer numbers as we have now. I mean, now, I really can't keep up anymore with what's going on in the city. There was a time when I was at the Food Policy Council where, I knew everybody, I knew everything that was going on. I was somehow connected to all the different pieces of the story. And now, happily, I guess, I've sort of given up on trying to keep track of it all, because it's so fantastically robust. And so that's the huge shift of the last 20 years. And the city now has a much better sense of itself as a place where food innovation should happen. We've still got this implementation gap. I mean, we've got a lot of good ideas, a lot of frames to move forward, but the actual moving part of it isn't really happening. And unfortunately, that's in many ways the story of food policy in this country. I mean, we don't have a national food policy. We don't have provincial food policy. At least municipally, we've got a food charter.
Tell us a bit about the food charter, because I'm not sure everyone will know what it entails.
Well, the food charter was the brilliant construction of my replacement at the Food Policy Council, Wayne Roberts. And Wayne built on some of the stuff we did in the 90s. I mean, we made all kinds of mistakes in the 90s. Understandably, you're starting something up. You don't really have any templates, any models to draw on. We made all kinds of tactical errors, but we did get something passed called the Toronto Declaration on Food and Nutrition, which is an admittedly boring title. But the city was into declarations at the time. This is 91, 92. There were these declarations on the environment, declarations on these other things, so we called it the Toronto Declaration on Food and Nutrition, and it laid out the broad policy thrust for a municipal food agenda. And then, of course, I mean, the art I finally realized of working in a municipal environment was you had to get involved in practical projects. You had to get those things up and running. But then you needed to argue for a policy framework to support them. So you had to go back and forth between programs and program design and policy development. So that the declaration became a way of convincing City Council and needed a policy framework to support all these projects that we'd actually managed to help get off the ground. And then once we had the policy, then we could go back to City Council and say, well, we got this policy, now we really should be doing something about implementing it. So it was a bit of that kind of a game. A lot of this kind of politics is a game of sorts.
So when you're trying to talk to people who don't spend all their time thinking about food and the systems behind it, how do you explain to them both what a food system is and why it's broken at all?
Right. Well,
what's urgent about this?
Well, the big urgencies are that health, and this is a key tactical driver in Canada because we have publicly funded health insurance. We're basically all paying for each other's dietary habits. If you've got good ones, you're not a draw on the system, so to speak. If your dietary habits aren't so good, or if there are forces that are constraining your ability to acquire or afford a nourishing diet, and a lot of those things are not personal choices. They're actually these larger systemic forces that constrain what people can and can't do. All those things we end up paying for as taxpayers because we have publicly funded health insurance. So we have this huge opportunity to argue that we need to transform the way we see food. We need to make food much more a food health promotion strategy if we're going to solve a lot of the healthcare crises we have. And we do have crises. I mean, we still have this acute care-driven system where most of the discussion about change is mostly about, you know, the administration of health services. It's not where it should be is how do we make changes so that there's less demand for healthcare services? How do we change people's health so that they're not always in and out of doctors' offices and hospitals? And food is a huge piece of that. We actually know that. I mean, we know from the data that food is a big piece of that story. But we can't quite make the leap to implementing changes in the food system. So that's one of the huge crises. Another one is environment. Obviously, the food system is a huge generator of environmental problems. The food system is probably the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. When you look at all the sort of the social and economic subsystems, you know, the food system may be responsible for 25 to 30% of all emissions, which hardly anybody talks about. And it's in North America, it's probably the biggest, agriculture is probably the biggest polluter of water systems. And we've still got major problems with soil erosion, biodiversity decline, all these things. That's another huge piece of it. And then really the third piece is this unbelievable lost opportunity around economic development. Food, air, and water, the three biological requirements for life, right? Why can't we design an economy around the things that are most required? We treat food as a strictly private sector activity instead of seeing it as a public good. But then the way we treat it as a private sector activity in no way optimizes the economic benefits that could actually flow from it if we were to properly design it to accomplish some of these broader purposes. So those are three big pieces. And then, of course, there's another huge cultural piece, which is, sort of some way epitomized by the square tomato story again, or some of the 7 heinous concoctions of the fast food industry. Anybody see that list, the 7 heinous concoctions of the fast food industry? Let me do a quick digression.
Go on.
Because this says a lot about the cultural state of food in North America, right? This came out of Alternate last year. Number 7, the Krispy Kreme Donut Sundae. Number 6, Starbucks Mocha Coconut Frappuccino Blended Coffee with Whipped Cream. Number 5, Cheeseburger Fries. I think they take the cheeseburger and they do something to it and then they form it into fries. I bet it tastes real different from the fries you've just been eating. Number 4, the KFC Famous Bowl. I can't remember what's in this, but some of the people who ate it described it as deep fried goo. Number 3, Hardee's Monster Thick Burger, 1,420 calories and 107 grams of fat. So 1,420 calories, that's about 2/3 of the average person's daily requirement in one meal, and 107 grams of fat, that's like double the typical fat intake, all in one meal. And this one actually, number 2, has just been advertised, just been released in Canada, big fanfare. It was in the United States earlier, just now released in Canada, the KFC Double Down. 2 slices of fried chicken instead of bread with bacon and cheese in between. And the number 1 fast food heinous concoction, Domino's Oreo Cookie Pizza. So, I mean, obviously this says some terrible things about, these are obviously extreme examples, but it says a lot about the state of food culture. And that has huge impacts because, not only is it strictly a dietary consideration, but also there's more and more evidence that, the less time we spend breaking bread together, the less time we spend eating together, the more sort of larger system-wide socio-cultural problems get generated, and it does actually have an impact on people's health. The people who are isolated and eating alone often have worse health, somehow associated with this process. So the cultural piece is huge, and of course what's so delightful about places like this and so many places in Toronto now is that you can find a place where you feel like you're reconnected with food culture.
So we've had an election in the past few days. If I was to get you a meeting with the mayor and his new council, what would you be putting at the top of their food systems agenda?
Well, the first thing I do is try
Pipe down, Hastings.
That was Neville. That was Neville.
Gravy.
Gravy. Gravy's good. Yeah.
Fries with gravy.
well, actually, this sort of speaks to what I do. I mean, the first thing I try and suss out is what's the mayor's food story. Because the bizarre thing about well, it's sort of a tragedy about politics, and you would know this probably better than most, is that a lot of what gets people mobilized is not some kind of a rational policy discourse about what needs changing, and of course there's big questions about our current mayor's capacity to do that. But having been a gadfly for many years, it hasn't been his role to think in larger policy terms.
But this is actually important because there are a lot of people who are buying the KFC, right? And
Yeah.
there are a lot of people for whom this is not just this is a treat. This is something they look forward to at the end of the day. And I think the food movement has to take those appetites as seriously, right, as some of its own dogma. So how do you convince people who aren't inclined to care about food, who are in positions of power, to actually do things tangibly that would support the sort of food strategy you're describing?
Well, the first thing is to find out what he's worried about.
Right.
Because everybody's worried about something related to food.
Okay.
I've never met a person who was totally delightfully, blissfully happy about food. There's always something. A member of the family lost their job in the food industry. So-and-so family members got, heart disease. So-and-so's got something else. We used to have this nice stream at the back where we could fish. Can't fish anymore. What's wrong with those tomatoes? Everybody's got something about food. And when this really struck me, actually, was when I was working with the Food Policy Council. There was a city councilor named Tony O'Donoghue from the West End, who anybody in Tony's ward?
No, I know Tony.
Remember Tony? So Tony blocked everything we ever tried to do at the Food Policy Council.
He's a lovely man.
Yeah, totally blocked everything. And then about 5 years in, he phones me up one day and he says, I want to take you to lunch. Oh God, what's this about? Well, it turned out he'd just been diagnosed with a heart condition. His doctor had said, you got to change your diet. And suddenly, Tony O'Donoghue sees the light. And all of a sudden, he wants to know everything about the Food Policy Council agenda and how to implement it. Becomes one of our biggest allies. So maybe there's such an opportunity with the mayor. I don't know for sure, but that would be a start.
I have an idea. Why don't you
out.
challenge him? No, seriously.
Well, the other piece, of course, is that the city has a food strategy that's being, brought forward to council. Peter Dorfman.
He's not here. I did actually invite him.
Right. But so Peter Dorfman at the Public Health Unit is involved in getting this off the ground. Wayne Roberts has been a key actor, and so a lot of the pieces are in place. The question, of course, is how to roll it out in a way that will generate some acceptance. And of course, as we all are wondering about our new mayor, does he have the ability to make friends? If he doesn't, he's a lame duck. If he can't create alliances, we have a weak mayor system. A lot gets driven by council members and alliances within council. So, as has always been the case, it was the case when I was working for the Food Policy Council. Somebody's got to create enough of a mass of voting, either with or without the mayor, to make something happen. And so it's going to be the same process here, I think, with implementing the food strategy.
One of the interesting elements in your report is it's not just a divide between private and public production. It's rethinking agriculture itself, because often we think about it as an exclusively rural concern. That's what happens in farm country. And you're saying that no, urban agriculture is the way to go. 10% of our vegetable produce could be grown within the city limits.
Yeah.
How would that work? What would that look like?
Well, that's a real interesting question. Because we're although we have little pieces of it, we're so far from having a real robust urban food production system, production and distribution system in Toronto. Our premise in doing this study was to say, well, do we have the land base, or the spaces base more accurately, to produce 10% of our current fresh vegetable requirements. I decided to leave out the French fries and the frozen peas and corn. But fresh vegetables, what are we roughly consuming in Toronto, and do we have the space in the first place to actually produce that? Because of course the immediate presumption is that we don't have enough spaces in a place like Toronto to pull this off. Probably about 75% of the city is built, and about 18% of it is still considered in green space. And so basically we were saying, well, could we divert some of that 18% to food production and not necessarily create inefficiencies or tensions in neighborhoods, competing uses around some of these spaces. And what we discovered was that, the space is there. We have to rely fairly extensively on rooftops. A study out of Ryerson a few years ago identified the potential for 5,000 hectares, which is a huge amount of space, 5,000 hectares of rooftop greening space. Now, how much of that we could actually use for rooftop growing is a little bit unknown, because growing requires more rooftop infrastructure than just greening. But our estimate from the study was that we need about a quarter of that space identified in their work for growing, and then the rest of it could actually come from the ground. And then, of course, the interesting thing about Toronto, which we sort of forget, just like we forget that Toronto is a waterfront city half the time, we also forget that Toronto actually has a bunch of farms in it already. We've actually got 70-odd farms in the city of Toronto. Most of them are in the northeast, around the Rouge. So it's not like we don't have any history of this, and we also still have lots of zoning of land that in the city that's actually still zoned for food production. But everybody's kind of forgotten about that too, including most of the planners. So we've got this huge opportunity.
There were a number of terms that I kind of picked out that I thought were fascinating. Food deserts, many people have heard about, but the food auctions, field heat, the importance of having post-harvest facilities in the city, but then also this idea of soil banks.
Yeah.
What's a soil bank?
Well, the idea is, of course, the city has a lot of contaminated soil, and so what do you do about that? And you can't run a soil cleaning process or a remediation process at minimal expense if it's really super contaminated. I mean, we know it just from east of here in the former Ataratiri lands. The original design for that whole neighborhood was kiboshed because the soil was so contaminated with industrial pollutants. So what they call remediation, soil remediation, is an expensive process, but you can do more modest things. You can use plants to remediate, and you can also use these banks where you actually collect good soil, because of course so much of the development sector doesn't really optimize the soil that it's stripping off in order to create these urban spaces, these residential spaces or buildings. So you want to try and bank that in some way. But I mean, the big thing about urban agriculture is that it's really only worth doing if you can do it in a way that doesn't compete with your existing farm base, your existing food shed. So the real focus is on import substitution. How do you substitute fresh vegetables that are coming in primarily from California and Florida during our growing and storage season? And if you're going to do that, to really do it well, you've got to figure out not just the growing piece, but also the distribution piece, because it really doesn't make any sense in environmental terms, for example, to have a whole 200 or 300 urban farmers all throw their produce into the back of their pickup truck and then drive it to another part of the city. Because then, pickup trucks spew as much greenhouse gas emissions on a ton-kilometer basis as an airplane. So you don't get necessarily any benefits from getting rid of all this stuff you're importing and the emissions they spew, the trucks spew particularly, if you've got everybody running around in half-ton trucks. So you got to come up with a different distribution model. You've got to figure out who the buyers are, how are you going to link the buyers and the sellers, because I mean the food system unfortunately is loaded with market failure. If capitalism works, the idea, of course, is that buyers and sellers can find each other. The price signals tell everybody, what something is worth. Everything is properly costed. Very little of that actually happens in the food system. So you can't rely on the marketplace to do these kinds of reallocations that we're talking about. It requires some kind of policy or NGO level or community-based intervention to make it work. And probably a lot of you are working with NGOs that are doing food work, and in a sense, a lot of the work you do is driven by this market failure. You're having to intervene in things that the neoclassical economists say the food system should be taken care of in and of itself, but it doesn't. So designing an urban ag system would similarly require some serious interventions on the part of government and NGOs to make it work.
If you're to get at anything close to scale.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we have all, as I said earlier, we have all kinds of beacons of light out there. We got all these fantastic projects that are showing us where we could go. But right now, this alternative stuff is maybe only 1% of the food system.
Yeah.
And at 1%, I mean, it's hugely valuable to obviously a lot of people, including many of us in this room, but it doesn't have a big impact on the system. If we want to turn it into a transformative enterprise, which is probably what most of us are hoping for, then we've got to figure out how to take it to another level.
I've got just two more questions for you, and then we're going to open it up to everyone else. Many people in this room will probably be familiar with the Cuban food revolution when the fertilizer subsidies were withheld with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the sort of both economic and agricultural transformation that resulted. But short of that kind of drastic shift, who gets this right? Like, if you want to plant in the minds of everyone here some success stories that they should be talking about, when they meet with friends who don't care as much about food systems, that they can say, oh, but do you know about what?
Well, Laurie Stahlbrand is here from Local Food Plus. We got some people from Food Share in the back of the room. There's probably a bunch of other folks from different organizations. So, like, these are the centers of innovation. This is where a lot of the most interesting stuff.
Here in Toronto.
In Toronto, this is where a lot of the most interesting stuff is happening. And a lot of what these organizations are doing are essentially without any significant support from the state, which is a real tragedy. I mean, we're now at a moment in time, I feel, where governments are sort of paralyzed by the complexity of the change process. There are a bunch of things that have happened that have made it increasingly difficult for government units, departments of agriculture, for example, to actually take any kind of leadership on this stuff. So the big challenge now, I think, is for the so-called civil society, which includes most of us, and NGOs to try and drive changes and then to draw the state in to change in a different way than we might have in the past. Excuse me. I mean, one of the tragedies of the democratic deficit, we were talking about that earlier, is that in agriculture, most of the things that should be a parliamentary discussion are not. And yet, a lot of our work traditionally as civil society actors has been to assume that if we can convince the political level, the parliamentary level, to affect a certain kind of change, then it will happen. The reality is that now there's such a gap between the parliamentary level and the bureaucratic level, and so much of the food policy making, what little of it there is in this country, resides actually in the bureaucracy, that a lot of the decision making is completely subterranean.
Just regulatory.
It's basically regulatory, and even below the level of regulation, it's in these things that are called regulatory directives and protocols. So talk about boring documents, as you were saying off the top. I mean, it's a snooze fest. Actually, they're great for insomnia, having spent many hours reading these things and falling asleep on top of them. But they're critically important because it's a lot of these documents which are buried, so-called, within the bowels of a lot of the civil service buildings in Ottawa and Queen's Park, is actually where the policy making is happening. So the next challenge, unfortunately, for a lot of us in social movements is going to be that we have to figure out ways of working with that level, that subterranean level. The good news is that they really don't have much to work with, so if you could figure out how to work with them, they'll take your stuff holus bolus and run with it. And that's been my experience as a consultant for the last 10, 15 years. So it's a huge opportunity if we can rejig the way we work, and we could have a huge impact. We could do a lot of the scaling up and out by getting the state to support a lot of this good stuff that's already happening.
We were talking when you first came in about how this does run in the family, and that your dad went from McGill then to Nova Scotia Agricultural College and was dean there, right? And you said that towards the end of his life, I mean, having been a part of the great 1950s kind of green revolution era where, you know, new food products were being brought to market, new additives, new cultivation practices. I mean, that was an exciting place to be. But you said that you didn't agree all that often with him, and that by the end of his life, he started to make amends. He started to see things
Yeah.
maybe in a different light and realized how, he made some assumptions and perhaps got some things very wrong. I want to put that question to you. When your daughter graduates in a number of years from now and she's asking you to recount the longer story of the food movement that you've been a part of, what mistakes do you think you'll be trying to explain away?
I'm always actually trying to correct my own mistakes. I mean, I feel like I keep coming back to the same material over and over again and try and do it right the second or the third time because I blew it the first or second time. I mean, this report actually, the Metcalf report on scaling up urban agriculture, back in the 90s at Food Policy Council, it was one of our huge failures that we couldn't try and do what we're proposing now. We should have been able to do it in the 90s and we blew it. So in many ways, I keep coming back to the same places and try and do them right the second or third time. I mean, my dad was a really interesting guy. He was a classic. He was from Cape Breton. He was a Cape Breton storyteller. His main purpose in life actually was to keep everybody happy. The only reason I discovered after he left his job at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College that he was so successful there was because he kept everybody happy. And he had lots of money to throw around in those days. Of course, money is a nice social lubricant.
Makes people happy.
Makes people happy. So unfortunately, I don't have any money to throw around, so I can't sort of fall back on that strategy. But yeah, he was really interesting watching him. Somebody who grew up in the so-called golden era of chemical agriculture. He was a chemist by trade, and he began to finally have sort of second thoughts about a lot of these things they'd work on. I'm really hoping for myself I don't get to the end of my life and have second thoughts, which is why I keep coming back to this stuff and trying to do it right now so I won't sit there in my dotage and say, oh shit, I should have done that.
Well, thanks for that. Why don't we get some follow-up questions from the room here? We've got another 15 minutes or so for questions. Anybody like to, yeah, the back.
I just wonder if there's a place in the world you can look at where they are almost doing it right, or was there a time in history where they almost did it right?
Well, in Canada we had these 5 interesting moments where we could have done food policy right, and we didn't. So it's not like the moments don't arise. They are there, and for whatever reason, I actually would like to do a big project looking back at the history of all this stuff. Hope to do that sometime in the next few years, to try and extract, what are the reasons why we didn't seize the moment, so to speak. But clearly other places have done a better job at seizing what moments arose. Norway in the 1970s did a pretty interesting job of linking agriculture and health. And they had a whole strategy around reconstituting the way their agriculture worked, and were trying to relate it to health objectives. And they had some significant successes there at a macro level at improving population health. There's a lot of stories out of certain municipalities in Brazil that are very inspiring. Belo Horizonte would be one, where the municipality there has really embraced food security as a strategy, and they've got dozens and dozens of programs that have really had an impact on the conditions of low-income people in that city. Cuba is still actually an interesting example. I mean, I was in Cuba in '83 when they were just beginning to question the Soviet bloc model of agriculture. I mean, I saw bigger equipment in Cuba than I'd seen on the prairies at that point, to give you a sense of the scale of it all. And of course, they dramatically transformed it under conditions of extreme pressure. And obviously, it's a unique model, but I think there are many important things to extract from that. So yeah, there are places that have done a way better job than we have.
Question over here.
Yes, a little bit more on the question, I want to raise an issue with how you are taking for granted that bureaucracies are inert, inaccessible, hard to move. My own work and experience in Vancouver is work that's initiated from within the bureaucracy in the development of a plan, a regional food system plan for the Greater Vancouver Regional District. This comes out of what you call the bureaucracy. And I think it's a mistake in terms of some of the work I've done to assume that those reporting bureaucracy don't share some of the concerns and interests that those of us who are here have in common. So part of the kind of difficulty, it seems to me, that movements run into is that they assume that on the other side of the process of establishing a policy, there's a wall that is a barrier. And some of the work I've done suggests that this is not. This is in Vancouver, which is, of course, a little different from Toronto. It's not as big, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, I suspect that some of the same kind of processes where issues of sustainability become something that is professionally interesting to bureaucrats. And I think we should not, in terms of the kind of ways we think about working in groups coming out of the community, we should not ignore the possibility that bureaucrats also are members of the community, that they have some of the same kinds of concerns. And there are organizations in which bureaucrats across Canada, like they have professional status, if they represent sustainability and have found ways of operating managerially that function within them. So this is just to raise that issue.
No, I'm actually agreeing with you. I'm saying what you're saying,
Okay.
which is that there are these huge opportunities. The problem as civil society movements is we haven't properly seized them.
Yeah.
Because there are these certain natural alliances, at least with certain places and pockets within the system, and that they are really actually desperate to make connections to a larger sphere of influence because they recognize that they're so constrained internally by forces beyond their control often to implement things. The other thing is, of course, that what happens municipally and regionally is usually there's an opportunity for way more progressive things there, and your Vancouver experience would share that, would indicate this. Yeah.
Offer, in some ways, greater possibilities for action than
That's right.
provincial
And even you look at what's happening provincially in BC right now around food security, there's been some very innovative stuff going on. But once you get to the provincial and the federal level, it gets more and more difficult to make those connections and allegiances and to create those relationships of trust. But if you can do it, as I said, you can have a huge impact on the system, and the people you work with internally will be able to run with certain things and have a big impact on the way things are reconfigured internally.
Further questions? Yeah.
I do a lot of work with First Nations people in the province of Ontario and Canada around environmental issues. And so my question to you is, how can we ensure that there's food security for everyone? I know earlier you were talking about food as a common for everyone, and I agree with that. And so when we go into Northern Ontario and into remote First Nation communities, it's appalling. It's cheaper to buy, junk food than it is to buy a liter of milk, which is, depending where you are, $12. A loaf of bread, it's just astronomical. So how can we ensure that there's policy put in place that will enable everyone in Ontario to have culturally nutritious, affordable food?
Well, that's the huge agenda, right? I mean, and there's no one answer, and it's going to take years and years to implement. I usually work with, a kind of a transition framework. I try to think of, what can we accomplish in the next few years? What's 5 to 10 years down the road? What's 20, 25, 30 years down the road? How do we link them up so that they're each transition arena isn't orphaned, isn't separated from the other? And of course, one of the first ways to start on a lot of these things is to actually try and recapture things that used to exist and refine them so that they actually work better and fit more into a long-term transition frame. So, the food mail program, for example, in the north, which I think has largely been eliminated. Have you heard?
Yeah,
it's largely gone now, right? Well, this was a very important state subsidy to food transport, which significantly reduced costs. And at least at one point, there was some discussion, I'm not sure what came of this, where they actually realized that the whole approach had to also be linked, the subsidy approach had to also be linked to opportunities for healthy eating. And so they were actually going to, reconsider some of the subsidies to the so-called junk foods and there were others, they're going to incentivize the good stuff and disincentivize the bad stuff, so to speak. But that would be one piece, an early stage strategy that could have some kind of an impact as you build on a whole lot of other issues. Now, clearly, there are long-term mega things around contamination and country foods, and how do we reduce all that, and trying to create a space for people to optimize their own cultural traditions around food. I mean, that's a huge long-term agenda. The big thing in my mind now is that we have no national food policy that actually names all these things as a priority. And it's actually now one of my projects is to try and start naming that stuff and try and create what's called a joined up food policy framework. How do we name all these pieces and connect them and then show the evolutionary stages of making it happen? And connecting back to the earlier discussion, we're going to probably have to do it at a relatively detailed level in order to have any hope of it having an impact. I mean, there are processes going on right now. There's actually about 5, it's really exciting in a certain way. There's about 5 food policy development processes going on that include discussion of Aboriginal issues and other things. In many ways, the most exciting is what's being driven by the People's Food Policy Project. Because it organizes so many civil society actors from across the country. It's deficient in certain ways, but it's more robust in its conception of what food policy actually means than any of the other initiatives. But believe it or not, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture's got a thing going on. The Conference Board of Canada. I mean, these are not the places where we would expect food policy discussions to be happening. The federal government has for some years had an internal process called the National Food Policy Framework, which we can't get much detail on. So there's actually some kind of a big food policy moment potentially going on. Another one of these moments I was talking about earlier. And the big question is, can we seize it in some way and try and shape it and drive it? And this would be one of a number of things that have to be deeply embedded in what we produce.
Take 2 last questions. One, and then gentleman over there.
How do you think we locally can tap into that and advocate for a healthy food policy, which I know the city already has, and we've heard Peter talk, and take that into these other arenas, to bureaucracies, and tap into these places where a national food policy is being created? How can we as citizens participate in
Well, the first thing, a stage I think is to drive the city, to implement its own food strategy. There's this interesting sort of, I don't know what to call it, it's sort of like political politesse goes on in the Canadian system where when one level of government demands things of another level of government, the other level feels compelled at some level to respond, which doesn't necessarily mean they respond well. But basically, when we really took us a while to figure this out when I was at the Food Policy Council, but we would actually do stuff that was overtly designed to influence the provincial and federal level, and we would get City Council to send off an official communication to another level in the system where there was more jurisdiction, because clearly the city doesn't have that much jurisdiction over the food system relative to the provinces and the feds. So we would get the city to make certain requests, and somebody would have to read that. Somebody would have to read the background material that we prepared. Somebody would have to prepare a response for the minister or the deputy minister or whoever. And so it created an opportunity to build a bridge, have an impact, have some kind of influence. And we ended up having all kinds of meetings with senior federal people that I never imagined we would ever get from this, sort of so-called small municipal base. And the food strategy in Toronto could do that. Like, you can't believe, I was totally shocked at how paranoid and shaken other levels of government get when a municipality decides that food is a big part of its agenda. We worked on something called bovine growth hormone. We're trying to block the development of this genetically engineered, and of course, what we keep trying to do is to pull those Waterloo folks into the Toronto scene. But it is slowly getting better. The food desert story here is not as obviously acutely bad as it is in a lot of U.S. cities, which is the good news. And some of the some of the companies seem to have responded to some of the earlier work done in the 90s around food deserts. And now there's a prof at Ryerson, Nina Marie Lister, who's doing some very interesting stuff, and I'm hoping that her work on deserts will sort of be the next phase of influence on the planning folks. And of course, other people who work outside the formal retail system are actually using the food desert data to try and make decisions about where to locate a lot of their alternative food projects, which obviously don't completely cover the terrain of retail, a big supermarket, but they do pick up some of the slack that's going on. Some of the food box schemes, these kinds of things, are all using this kind of information. So I think we're moving in the right direction. It's often painfully slow and frustrating, but it's way better than it was in the early 90s, at least.
That's great. I don't know about you, but all of this talk of food is certainly making me hungry. I think it's time for supper, everyone, but I'm afraid we're not going to be serving you a big meal here or a chance to break bread. But I want to thank you very much, Rod, for being with us this evening and giving us a great conversation. You're going to... Fantastic and important work. I hope you get that meeting with council sooner rather than later. The bar is open a little bit longer, so if you would like to stand around, mill about, have a chance to chat individually. We won't be back until the new year in 2011 with the next mass talk. Instead, I hope to see many of you at the Betty Oliphant Theatre to welcome Richard Wilkinson here to Canada. Thanks very much, everyone, once again for coming this evening.